Mr. Ebubekir Ceylan for this session on independence. So, if you excuse me, I will be speaking in English because all our participants are English speaking in this panel.
I extend my warmest greetings to you all, and today we come together, we gathered here to discuss one of the most fundamental issues that has shaped the destiny of nations throughout history. It is the concept of independence. And this concept is not only a political goal, but also a symbol of societal, economic, and cultural freedom. Independence represents the cornerstone of a people's ability to determine their own future, and it is a legacy that every generation must strive to preserve. Our panel today is structured around three speeches, and let us start with our first speaker, Professor Hatem Bazian from Zeytuna College, and we have unfortunately 15 minutes. The floor is yours, Doctor.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If I could get the slides for my presentation, if it's already there. Bismillah. Just on the introduction, I'm from UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, in Middle Eastern Studies and Ethnic Studies. And I wanted to frame my talk today in relations to the colonial present and the lack or missing independence that we see, with looking at seven themes that we can identify relative to the persistent durability of colonization. Even though that the 1960s and 70s so many states gained their independence, but this independence have to be looked upon into a transformation of the structures of control and domination, from direct military control to distant control that has political, economic, and so on. So,
hocamızın slaytını koyabilir miyiz? Have you submitted your?
Yes, I did, and they said it was good to go.
They say no.
So let me begin with the first element of the seven overarching colonial aspects. One is epistemology. The epistemological structure that we have globally is Eurocentricity dominates the epistemological structures, even as we speak about political discourses, independence, nation states, formations, everything related to the ideas are centered around Eurocentricity. We have not yet broken or actually offered a total unique independent epistemological structure. And so again, the colonial present and barriers to the will of political independence. And part of my work comes from the book that I published on erasing the human. And I quote Huntington. He says, the West won the world not by superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather by its superiority in applying organized violence. And when we talk about epistemology, we still think that the West is giving us ideas, and we have been almost having a West living in our mind, measuring everything that we actually do relative to whether the West accept us and accept us within Eurocentricity rather than having complete independence. One thing that I also wanted for us to think as a 500 plus years, when we talk about Columbus' journey across the Atlantic, many people say he discovered America, and he was searching for an alternative route to India to find spices. That's actually not what he wrote in his diaries. Columbus' diaries, he said on the 26th of December, 1492, Columbus says he wanted to find enough gold and the almost equally valuable spices in such quantity that the sovereigns will undertake and prepare to go to conquer the Holy Sepulchre. For thus I urge your highness to spend all the profits of this my enterprise to the conquest of Jerusalem. So literally, Columbus was planning a crusade to the west to come and counter the Muslim from the east, with the idea to prepare for the second coming of Christ, as well as preparing the end of time. I would say he said that this will be accomplished within 3 years. My sense is that the British were able to accomplish it in 200 plus years. What is critical, when the British entered Palestine, they said with this comes the end of the Crusades after 673 years of Muslim control. That's epistemologically we have to understand both the connection of the history of Columbus' journey and project, as well as the continued colonization of the Muslim world. The second, when we talk about colonization, it covers 85% of the globe. So the European colonial project was global in nature. It covered every continent, and it touched the known and brought the unknown parts of the world into the newly developed colonial system. So once we understand that 85% of the world's surface in 1914 have been actually touched by the European colonization. And we speak about the British having the sun never sets upon the British Empire. And still we are right now experiencing the extension of the British Empire to the American Empire that has overwhelmingly. With it also the rewiring of the world. All right, rewiring of trade routes, rewiring of communication networks. That takes place again over a 500-year period. The colonization of Africa. Just yesterday there was a discussion. 600 million people in Africa don't have electricity. Just let me repeat, 600 million in Africa don't have electricity. Yet Africa has been ravaged in terms of its resources, continued to be pillaged. It's one of the richest continents in the world, and yet it has been structurally made impoverished. Colonization is the structural underdevelopment of the global South. Let me repeat. Colonization is the structural underdevelopment of the South. It was not accidental. It was actually intentional and continues up to the present. We talk about the British Empire, all these fledgling places. We think about the road from South Africa to Egypt, which was a project of the British, that Cecil Rhodes, who had the audacity to name a country on his behalf, Rhodesia, right? They finally, Rhodesia gained its independence, it became Zimbabwe. So we're still in thinking about the networks and how the world is shaped by this reality. Now come to the present. The United States have military operation in 39% of the world's countries. The United States has bases, right? Almost 45 bases in the Arab Muslim world. So when we talk about why the Arab world and the Muslim world is not helping Gaza, because we are subject to the colonial present. Colonization does not mean that you have to have physical troops in everywhere, but you have strategic troops deployed in every region. And the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, European, NATO have aided Israel assault on Gaza by providing intelligence, by providing protection, and providing the resources. So we need to understand that what's called war on terror has been transformed into expanding U.S. footprint across the Arab and Muslim world. Third, it's a racial project. Why is it that the West is not, when global South people die, we don't actually register? Because we belong to a subcategory of human being, right? So the colonial era was distinctly racial. It emerged at the intersection of the human and subhuman. We are deemed within the Western epistemological structure and the racial structure as subhuman. That's why 1.5 million people die in Iraq and nobody is taken to task. So far, up to today, 300,000 have been killed in Gaza. Not only the 53, but for the Lancet back June, it said 186. We are talking about 300,000 and total silence because we belong to the subhuman category. And we speak about the people who died in Yemen, people who died in Afghanistan, people who died in Congo, in Sudan. is the same because they belong to the subhumanist category. Human rights does not include everybody that is defined as a human, because the human rights does not extend to those in the global south. And again, my evidence will be nobody has been taken to task for the debacle that have taken place in Iraq. And I say in terms of what's taken place in Gaza today, we'll have to wait and see whether anyone is actually will be taken to task. Lindsey Graham said that the ICC was not created for global south countries. Was not created for the United States, was not created for Israel, was not created to take Great Britain, which basically saying that there are two different categories of people. There are people who have human rights, there are people who have meaning, people who are recognized for their political personhood, independence, and they have agency, and there are people that don't. We collectively, right, we do not have that recognition in the categorization. And unfortunately, we stand in front of the mirror every day and we say, can you see me? Right? The fault is in us, not on the person that is already telling you that we can't see you because your status and your meaning, you're meaningless in relations to your humanness. So we have to understand that epistemology and that structure. So the white man burden is still there, even though the white man was always the burden and continues to be the burden. And that's part of the racial project in terms of race and racism and how it's a global phenomena. This is part of the long history of the dehumanization, right, that continues to be part of the reality that people have lived. Right? Race and racism, for Roman, the people classified above the line of the human are recognized socially in their humanity as human beings and thus enjoy access to rights, human rights, civil rights, women's rights, and labor rights, material resources, and social recognition to their subjectivities, identities, epistemology, spirituality, and so on. So that's, again, to understand what is this racial demarcation that exists. We belong to the category of subhuman, right, in relations to the Western colonial paradigm. And that's why you could actually engage in massive death and destruction without actually anyone having to answer for it. Colonial racism, we must say, this is actually the, from the Prime Minister in France. He says, we must say openly that indeed the higher races have a right over the lower races. I repeat, that the superior races have a right because they have a duty. They have the duty to civilize the inferior races. This was spoken in the French Parliament. You know, they celebrate the fact that the French Revolution, égalité, equality, fraternity, it's up to us. We think that it applies to us, right? And you think that because you enjoy possibly eating some French food and getting some French product, that all of a sudden you're included. It's just literally telling you in a specific way what it means. Fourth, economic capitalism and technology. The colonial era marshaled the fusing between newly developed modes of economic production and capitalism, technological innovation and exploration that is dissimilar to any pre-modern. And with it, you also include the military-industrial complex. The United States military budget is $869 billion, more than the 20 next countries combined. And that is a process of recycling massive resources. The business of war is war, and war is a business that is also have made making money out of death and destruction to be a maximum process. We are dealing with a death economy. So we have to, when we think about economic principles, economic ethics, economic morality, we have to challenge this process and not try to actually only engage in replication or imitation. All right? Now, also to understand that colonialism was a political and economic system, the need for outlets, meaning markets. And that continues. Most of the global South society are still raw material production that goes out to the global North and then finished product that are provided and dumped. Maybe there is an exception taking place in relations to China, but we have to understand what was behind the colonial system that continues to be the process of today. This is actually a map that comes out from the CIA page, which looks at Africa in terms of its resources. At least you give them credit. They know where the beef is. They know where the resources to get. And when we think about the Middle East, where we are, I have a problem using the term Middle East, but for purposes of this talk, we sit on the hub of the energy resources for the world, as well as the intersection of trade routes that continues to be in the middle of the global dynamics of the world. How Britain stole 45 trillion from India, all right? The British actually sucked almost every element of resources. When they came to India, it was 24% of the global GDP. When they left India, it's 3% of the GDP. And India was the breadbasket for the British. And in order to take the supplies and materials from India, they had to conquer Yemen, they had to conquer Sudan, they had to conquer Egypt, and then also open the Suez Canal. So I have never seen a criminal cartel like the British who actually made sure that whatever they robbed and stole made its way back to the museums and to all the places in London. So as you visit London and you see the resources, massive, massive resources that have been taken from India. France and Africa's gold. All right, France has the fourth largest gold reserves in the world, estimated at 2,436 tons and valued at about 111.8 billion. France does not have a single gold mine. Mali has no gold reserves, very little despite having 860 gold mines in the country and producing 50 tons of gold per year. France has troops in Mali today and is fighting terrorism, right? So that's the boogeyman today. We're fighting terrorism is literally robbing much of the resources in there. I know that I'm being given 1 minute, so I'm going to go through it. Genocides, all right, the onslaught of global settler colonialism made genocide a fact. You cannot actually understand colonization of the past and the present without understanding genocide. So we speak about the Palestinian genocide. We speak about the genocide. For me, Iraq was a genocide that unfolded in relations to the United States. All right? La Casas, who actually I'm going to say genocide in the Americas, he says La Casas, who's actually a Catholic, describes how the Spaniards thought nothing of knifing Indians by 10s and 20s and of cutting slices of them to test the sharpness of their blades. Two of these so-called Christians met two Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and for fun beheaded the boys. All right? So literally, again, in terms of the history of genocide in the Americas, and you could actually speak about the genocide in the Congo with King Leopold, in Algeria, the Aborigines. In France, it was a habit to sever the heads of resistant fighters and take them to France to be exhibited and to be studied, especially in the Museum of Man. You remember how when the Muslim post-Arab Spring, they began to actually speak about how the Muslims are uncivilized and all this. This is a long history, and in 2019, some Algerian anthropologists discovered that there's a group of skulls of Algerian resistance fighters from the 1840s that were kept by the French, and they demanded for it to be repatriated. So the multiple genocides in here, these are just a factual record that has to be accounted for. In Congo, 50% of the population was eliminated, as well as in India and other places. Slavery, again, and how it became a demand-driven. Mother lode, when Columbus came to the America, he said he discovered the mother lode of slaves and continued to inform it. And Christianity, religion, and colonization, I speak about imperial Christianity. And I want to conclude with the following. Unless we account for colonization of the present and how transform these elements collectively to continue to extend the dominant European American power dynamics over much of the global South, including the Middle East, we fail to understand what is the meaning of independence. We think independence is a matter of the UN recognizing us or going and doing tawaf around the White House for all of a sudden to be recognized as a junior partner in the nation-state development in the modern era. We have to understand, we have to reverse engineer the 7 pillars of colonization for us to reach independence and begin to put our ideas, our notions. Unfortunately, some of the best ideas are coming from Latin America, where they're beginning to contemplate their relationship to the colonial history and beginning to offer ideas of what a political system that is not dominated by Eurocentrism looks like. And I think that type of project we need to engage in order to make such transformation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hatem, for your outstanding presentation. You underlined the barriers to political independence. Now, I would like to give the microphone to Dr. Ibrahim Warde. He is a scholar and consultant in the fields of international finance and global political economy, and currently he is teaching at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be a part of this great conference. The title of the talk is Sovereignty and International Financial Institutions. So point number 4 in Hatem's presentation is related to what I'm going to be developing, which is what's really happening in the world of finance. Now, I'm going to make some very quick references to history before getting back to the present. So, the year 1875 was an interesting year because there were two very major countries and one empire from this part of the world who went bankrupt. Okay, so Egypt was bankrupted by a policy of very generous contributions by British and French investors that were in many ways intended to drive Egypt into bankruptcy, which happened in 1875. And what's happened next was that the creditors, again, principally French and British, but also other Europeans, were actually becoming members of the Council of Ministers of Egypt whenever there would be a kind of a political meeting of the Council of Ministers, etc. Then there would be representatives of the creditors. So there would be somebody from England and somebody from France who would be making decisions about how Egypt should run its economy so that it can service the debt. So around the same time, something comparable happened in the Ottoman Empire. Essentially, the Ottoman Empire was unable to pay its debts, and comparable events happened along with turmoil in a domestic setting. So back to the present. Right now, in terms of the connection between global financial institutions and individual countries, there's an interesting phenomenon, which is that you have very complex transactions and a very opaque system for a very simple reason, which is that nobody talks about the financial institutions themselves and the impact on sovereign countries. Instead, what people talk about is an abstraction called the market. So if you are in the field of finance, then every day you're going to try to follow what the quote unquote the markets did today. Did the Dow Jones go up or down, etc. And then you have a number of various players in the global markets, like ratings agencies, who basically grade countries based on their financial condition. So because of that abstraction of the market, it's never very clear who benefits from whatever affects the sovereignty of countries. So here, let's talk about modern Turkey. So there have been a number of financial crises, more recently in the period starting around 2018 or so, where there were a succession of financial crises. And the way in which we hear about that is about downgrades of the creditworthiness of a country like Turkey right now. But more generally, you have all those organizations that have essentially a power of life and death over independent governments through this very complex financial system, which gets, again, subsumed under the abstract notion of markets. So the part that is very interesting about trying to understand that is that you have people who are beneficiaries of the misfortune of countries and the loss of sovereignty and independence. And principally, you have financial speculators. So those of you who recently studied political economy and finance may have heard of kind of the late political economist Susan Strange, who wrote an important book in the 1990s, which was titled Casino Capitalism, which suggested the world of finance is a bit like a gambling joint, where you have some people placing bets. And typically, those who control a significant amount of money are the ones who can afford those bets. And if you look at the modern financial system, again, it's talked about in abstract terms, and when you take courses in finance, it's a sanitized version of what happens. But the ugly truth is that, again, in economics and finance courses, you hear about how finance creates value. In reality, a lot of finance extracts value. So again, we don't have too much time for me to go into a great deal of detail, but there is the sense that you have people like, and you have had a succession of villains, if you will, in the world of finance. Right now, a category of financiers who would fit in this world of villains are the private equity companies. So you see the ways in which you have groups of investors who buy companies like, let's say, newspapers or hospitals, things that in an earlier era were considered to be of public interest. And so they've been privatized by those private equity companies. And what those companies do is reduce the costs, hence the services that the public can get just to enrich themselves. So you have beneficiaries of that system that are close to the world of high finance. And all this does affect countries. So this is why it's useful to remember history and go back to what had happened, again, in this fateful year of 1875, and the fact that in Egypt, that was a period that started with turmoil, which a few years later, in 1882, brought British troops to Egypt. In the Ottoman Empire, I'm not going to explain to you, again, what happened in the late 19th century, but you know about all the turmoil. So finance is something that's extremely important in the way in which it transforms the relations between the world of finance and the political world. Now, one reason why finance gets away with it is that you have all sorts of tricks to hide the reality. You probably know the notion of Potemkin villages. So that's a reference to the fact that the Empress Catherine the Great used to have this minister named Gregory Potemkin. And what he did was he created artificial villages of peasants that were very happy. And those constructions would be moved from place to place when the empress was visiting her empire or when foreign ambassadors were trying to look at the state of affairs. So in the world of finance, you have a very systematic way of beautifying the ugly reality of finance. So for example, let's say you go to your bank and then you get horrible service. And then when you get out, you get a smiley-faced employee who asks you to rank the service of the bank. So you always have fictions that tend to project an image that's very different from the reality of like the ways in which like people, namely in this case, the bank clients who feel that they've been ripped off by their bank, but at the same time you have the smiley face that covers it up. So there are a number of those artifices that exist, and the current book I'm writing, I'm going to just give you the title, and hopefully in about 6 months or so, you'll be able to read it. So the title is Lipstick on a Pig, and the subtitle is Ethics in the Age of Financialization. Because the bottom line, after everything I've talked about, the interesting question is the so what question. Well, I think you have an impact of this situation on morality and ethics in the sense that reality has been completely deformed by the dominant discourse. And so this is why I think this is an important topic to really understand the way in which finance has the means to present a completely deformed image of what it really does. So I could talk for much, much more, but I'm going to stop here. If you have questions later on, I'll be glad to answer them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. In fact, you reminded us the historic examples of the Egypt and Ottoman Empire, Istanbul, in the last quarter of the 19th century. And with these examples, actually, we see that the financial institutions and especially the debt policies shape the decision-making processes of the sovereign states as well. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now we pass to our last speaker, and the last presentation will be on the foreign military forces and interventions. Dr. Sami Arian is a professor of Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, and he is also the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. The floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for organizing this panel. The idea of foreign intervention and military bases worldwide are just tools for a particular goal or grand strategy. And when we talk about the international order today, people recognize that it's an international order that was created in the aftermath of World War II, with the United States being the chief beneficiary of such order. It was done with its leadership in order to make sure that it maintains its hegemony over the entire world. The United States has three vital regions. In order to maintain such hegemony, it has a grand strategy that it has been applying since at least World War II. During the time between the end of the Second World War and the collapse of the Soviet Union around 1991, the United States looked at these three regions, basically Europe, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf and West Asia, North Africa, what we call, again, I have reservation on the word Middle East, but we're going to use it just to, because of the lack of time, actually, instead of repeating MENA region and all that. The idea is to make sure that great powers, for a long time it was Soviet Union, then it was weakened Russia, and now China, that these powers would not be a hegemon in their own regions. Because if they become hegemons in their own region, then they can go out and challenge the United States everywhere else. The United States, around the turn of the century, the 20th century, was able to go back and pretty much colonize the seas, so to speak, by building strong navy and controlling the trade routes around the world. But the grand strategy that it has been applying since World War II says that no single country or a combination of countries which are allied together would become a hegemon over their own region because that would allow them to go and challenge the United States. So what do? In order to prevent this from taking place, they build alliances and they have a policy called containment. So during the late 40s, when the Soviet Union started becoming, after, of course, World War II, more of a competitor and rival of US around the world, they built NATO in 1949, and then other institutions, including certainly military alliances like NATO, but also political and economic institutions. So when it comes to the first region after World War II, and the third region, it was, as I said, Europe and East Asia. But the middle region, the second region, has always been this region of the world, what we call the Middle East, or Persian Gulf, basically. And it's because of two main reasons. One is oil. Oil is very important as a commodity. It is the fuel. It is the commodity that fuels the engine of the industrialized world. It's very important not only that you control it, but you also control who has access to it. So the US has made a point, certainly, to make sure that these countries that have these resources are being pretty much in the American camp. And indeed, when you look at the history, that is very well the situation. But also, the other reason to maintain oil is because when the US delinked, in order to maintain the hegemony economically, the US in 1944, with Bretton Woods Agreement, says you can have the dollar, and that dollar can be exchanged at any time with gold, $35 per ounce. But after Vietnam, Nixon had no choice but to delink this because they were just printing dollars without any gold coverage for it. And they had to find a replacement. That replacement was indeed an agreement between Kissinger and Faisal in 1974, which says that oil would be sold by dollars. And if you are an oil importer and you have to bring dollars, then you have to bring it from the US, and therefore you are the true owner of this oil. So that was one of the reasons, or the main reason, why the US also was able to maintain its economic hegemony over the world and make the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. Today, about 80% of the transactions are made in dollars. About 62% of world trade, global trade, is in dollars. That's a huge advantage with a country that keeps printing with no cover. Today, we're talking about $34–35 trillion. Just imagine, think about that. In the second Reagan administration, around 1985, that's when the US reached $1 trillion. During Carter, 4 years prior, it was about $500 billion. Reagan's second term, $1 trillion. Now, move forward, that's less than, 40 years? Less than 40 years, we're talking about 35. That's 34. No other country can afford that and still has an economy except the US. The question is, how can they maintain this? Of course, the other reason about the importance of this is not the topic of this panel, it will be the topic of the next panel, which is the protection of Israel. I'm going to skip that. But now, the question is, how does the US maintain its hegemony? Basically, through, Dr. Bazian talked about $869 billion of defense budget. It's an unbelievable number, but how do they continue? Through these military bases. The US has about 8,000 military bases, about 7,200 or so in the United States, and about 800 around the world. These 800 bases are pretty much everywhere. I counted actually 63 bases in our region, that includes Turkey, but it's about in 12 countries. In 12 countries, they have actual military bases here. That means that's a lot of money. And by the way, one of the main reasons why the US had to delink the dollar from the gold was because of this, the spending on these bases. What happened is that all this spending that they did in Vietnam, who was collecting these dollars? It was France. France goes back and asks for the gold, and that's how part of how they got. And Nixon got tired, America got tired of de Gaulle telling them, where is my gold? So they just, okay, forget about it. We're going to de-link. The idea is that these are very important basis in which they can maintain their hegemony. And we have to understand that the US has this mentality that it has to be the so-called, quote-unquote, indispensable nation, the nation that can lead the world, in their own mind actually can also put the rules of this world. Everybody has to obey the rules. They don't have to obey any rules. Just you have to obey the rules because they are the indispensable nation. Now, when you look at how this military structure has been put in place, you'll find they have 7 different command centers, actually 8 with the strategic command. Strategic command is North Dakota that has to deal with the space command, nuclear weapons, and so forth. But you have the Northern Command for America, Southern Command in Panama for South America. You have the NATO for Europe. You have the Pacific Command. And then they created this central command in our region that spans through 21 nations. By the way, Israel is part of this. It was added by Trump because now Israel is integrated into the structure, the military structure of how to rule this region. This region extends from Egypt to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And you will find about 12 different Arab nations, Israel, and 8 non-Arab countries. Turkey is not part of it. Turkey is part of NATO. And you will find that this structure is pretty much dictates the different policies of how to maintain hegemony over this region. All the things that you see as diplomacy, politics, all other movements, they would have to come to serve this purpose, how to maintain this hegemony. We really don't have time to talk specifics about this, but it's very important to understand, just to give you a couple of examples, how they use this. Again, go back to the policy. I said the United States has a grand strategy. That grand strategy is not to allow any country to become powerful in which they can have an independent policy. Again, we're talking about independence, and also to extend its power beyond what it is allowed to do. So what happened in northern Syria? Has anybody thought about why does the US, at one point they had 13 military bases in Syria. Now they have less. They have about 900 soldiers because Trump decided to partially withdraw. But the question is, why is the US in northern Syria? The standard answer you get from the Pentagon, from the National Security Council, all these politicians, because of ISIS. Nonsense. Has absolutely nothing to do with ISIS. It had to do with Turkey under this current government. Turkey under this government trying to extend its power to become regional, not necessarily a hegemon, but regional power. It has bases outside Turkey, in Somalia, Libya, other places, and military presence. It has also other interests. And the US doesn't like any country to become powerful enough in which it can be outside the control of the US. So what do they do? Again, going back to the grand strategy. What is that grand strategy? You build an alliance, or you contain it, or what is called balancing. Balancing is a term, it's a misnomer really. Balancing means that you have a powerful country or entity, so you build around it a series of countries or one country in which you balance that power. But when you look at Turkey's neighbors, they're all weak. Bulgaria, Greece, Syria, which was basically dysfunctional until recently. Now it's even more dysfunctional until they rebuilt themselves. Iraq, which has been broken into 3 separate countries. So what do? They have to create something. Of course, Iran is a different story because the US cannot control Iran. So what do? They occupy northern Syria, where you have a substantial Kurdish population, because they know that this is the vulnerable thing about Turkey. Turkey will immediately go 180 degrees and go back and try to see how we're going to deal with this threat. It will no longer think about how I can expand, how I can do this or that. It wants to maintain its territorial integrity, because a powerful Kurdish state on the border of Turkey actually can break up the system. So for the past few years, Turkey has been concentrating on this. I've been asking the US to withdraw. US does nothing. In fact, it spent over $5 billion building this army, 50,000 people, building them in northern Syria, arming them with heavy weapons, has nothing to do with ISIS, giving them control of the oil fields so that they can develop an independent economy. All that is to check Turkey. So in 2018, if everybody can recall, what was the biggest issue in the world between October 2nd and November 30th? Do you recall? Every day we hear Khashoggi, 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 right? Every day. And the narrative was controlled by Turkey. So on November 30th, Erdogan and Trump meet in Buenos Aires during the G20. And then Trump is trying to save his body and says, when are you going to stop this nonsense? You did enough. Erdogan ignores him and said, when are you going to withdraw from Syria? Now that is Turkish interest. That's what Turkey wanted, because it knew that this was going to be damaging. And what's happening today, by the way, in Syria, to a large degree, would also be explained by this. So Trump gets the message. 12 days later, on December 12th, he calls Erdogan and said, we're going to withdraw from Syria. What happens in the United States? Hell breaks loose. Remember what happened to the Secretary of Defense? Mattis? He resigns. Tells you about the deep state. He resigns over this issue. Those who live in the United States will find it very strange that somebody's going to just resign because of difference in policy. But this is deep into what the Pentagon is committed to. It in their grand strategy. Trump is playing with fire. He never consulted anyone on this decision. And then the Secretary of Defense resigns. The Republican Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, who rarely talks about, those who live in the States, also rarely talks about foreign policy, has an op-ed piece in the Washington Post saying this is endangering American national security. The point I'm trying to make is the importance of how military bases are used to rob the people of their independence and impose on them the control and hegemony of the United States. My last point is, how does the United States deal with sovereignty issues? It depends whether you are a rich country or a poor country. I think Professor Warde talked about one of these that was used back in the 19th century. It's still used today. If you are a rich country, they dictate on you to put their money, the excess money, in their own economy, with very little ability to actually use that money. I have many stories, which I will spare because of time, is how they do that. Today, just about the rich Arab countries have about $1.7 trillion in American economy, and it's all under control. They can't do much in terms of impact American economy. Some of it is in treasury bills, others in different companies. But when one of the countries was under severe strain, I'm not going to name that country, you can guess, and they wanted to get American help, the price was that you have to invest in America $150 billion without the ability to withdraw it. That's the type they use for rich countries. What about poor countries? With poor countries, they just give them money and money and money. It's like a rope that you put around your neck until it is long enough that you can't get it out and they can pull it. That's how somebody mentioned about Turkey in 2018. So what does Trump do? With one minute left, with one tweet, I can destroy Turkish economy. What happens the second day? 30% down. How is that possible? Again, they just give you that. Turkey took about $400 billion. Today it has $500 billion debt. Not the government, private sector. But the government guarantees that it will be paid. So what do? There is not enough money for Turkish economy to pay this foreign currencies. That's why we keep saying this lira going down and down and down and down. That's the issue of independence. So we talked about political independence, economic independence, military independence. My last word here has to do with our first priority should be, as people who value the region, the people who have projects, who wants to develop this region, is to eradicate foreign influence. That should be our real project. Everything else should come secondary. Don't talk about Islamic State, Renaissance, Nahda. All these things will not happen. They will never allow you to happen. They will never give you the opportunity, actually, to even experiment until you get rid of that foreign influence. How we do that, that's a completely new panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. Unfortunately, due to the time limitation, we will not be able to take the questions. 8 minutes later, there will be the Gaza panel, Gaza Tribunal. It's an important panel. Therefore, there will be a break. But I kindly ask our panelists to stay one more minute here for gift presentation, and I invite Abdullah Zerrar to the scene, the chair of Cihan Numa in Istanbul. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you very much once again, dear participants.